I think he can give a better word about himself. So we are just 2 minutes short to go online. Maybe we can use this time to introductions so that there is some...
We're live on Facebook.
We are? Oh, great. If we are...
Yeah, now it's saying meeting is now streaming live.
Okay, great. So maybe it's time to switch to Waqar.
Now.
Yes. So,
Yeah, 1 minute
Waqar.
short.
Okay.
I would suggest, just because everyone usually has limited bandwidth, कि कोई भी और applications चले हुए तो वो बंद कर ले सिवाय Zoom के.
Yeah, true. I'm going to do the same.
Okay. So we can begin now.
We're live.
So we are, like many things at Habib University, we are breaking one of the trends at Pakistan, which is to start late. We start early, a whole minute early. Good. So I'm very happy to welcome all of you, our panelists, our faculty, our students. I am Waqar Salim. I am Assistant Dean of Dhanani School of Science and Engineering at Habib University. I'm also a faculty member in the Computer Science program. This public lecture series, of which this panel discussion will be an instance by Dhanani School of Science and Engineering at Habib University, is an attempt by us to introduce academic topics to the public discourse. Specifically, our aim is to cover topics related to science and technology. Under this series, we have been hosting lectures, discussions, and presentations since 2014. So we are well into our 7th year now. We specifically aim at topics which are at the intersection of science and technology and society. Science and technology has long been an obscure topic, maybe considered out of the grasp of the general public, which is ironic because the outcome and the product of science and technology affect our daily lives in so many ways. This call right now, this meeting, this panel discussion is a perfect example of how science and technology has changed our lives. Otherwise, we'd all be sitting, because of the pandemic, we'd be sitting and we'd not be able to have this discussion, which hopefully will be very interesting. And this is the first event that we're having this year. I would otherwise be welcoming all of you on our wonderful campus. As those of you who have been to our campus will agree that it's quite nice. We'd all be sitting in Tariq Rafi Hall right now, and the atmosphere would be much more conducive to this talk. But I'm sure wherever you are, I hope you're comfortable. I hope you're safe, and that we're able to have a good and interesting discussion today. Our topic today, I will not talk a lot about that because Dr. Moiz is going to talk about it. But I think our topic today is very apt to this series. So we do want to, under the theme of the intersection of science and technology, its impact on our society, that is directly what we'll talk about today. So where has engineering education in Pakistan been lacking? There are some statistics, some data that our students have gathered that they'll present. And we have with us very interesting panelists who have good insight into the industry and who are in a good position to provide us that insight and suggestions. So with that, I will introduce the panel moderator today. That's Dr. Moiz Anis. He is a faculty member in our ECE program, Electrical and Computer Engineering program. He has a long track record. I believe this is his 3rd or maybe even 4th year of involvement in the public lecture series. He is a very passionate advocate and supporter of the public lecture series. I guess I will not be overstating if I say that the public lecture series continues to exist largely because of his enthusiasm and energy and efforts. So Moiz, we really appreciate your efforts, and I'm sure already we can see your efforts. You have arranged a very interesting panel. I look forward to an interesting discussion, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Waqar. It's truly a humbling experience to hear these nice words from our seniors and mentors like you. And of course, I'm very glad to have a wonderful panel with us. So would like to just do the formality, which is a part of the duty of mine that we curated. We had been thinking about this topic for quite a while. So just to do some introductions to the topic and then to our honorable panelists. So the topic is opportunities of growth in the engineering sector of Pakistan. Today, by the way, this marks the 50th event which I am curating and organizing from the platform of DSSC Public Lecture Series. I did my first event with Nida Farid, so she's already a part of our panel in 2017. So, so this tells that how long it has been an association with this entire journey. So today's topic is dedicated to the engineering spirit, I would say, not specifically engineering. So it means like the kinds of hands-on things we do in our day-to-day life. So somehow, somewhere, every one of us has an engineer within themselves. This dates back to even the human evolution. So I wouldn't say that the time when none other disciplines were there, engineering was there. So human beings were engineering their environment for food, for shelter, for other clothing and other needs. So it's something that should be close to everyone's individual's heart, because but then we have a whole community of engineers who dedicate themselves and take this responsibility of the growth in terms of infrastructure, where you call it industry, you call it development sector. So the problem which we are struck with right now in our country is that there is a surplus of labor. And we have like engineering graduates which are more in numbers, and there is a dearth of these available opportunities at hand. The job market is not promising. There is some sense of pessimism, and in fact, even kind of opportunities we have, they are sometimes not appropriate and live up to the kind of curriculum and the experience which students go through. The graduates, they ultimately expect something from their like as a part of it. Once they have completed a very hard journey of completing engineering education, they expect some decent remuneration, which is not there. So we just want to explore that what is beyond this local void, and how can we see it from different angles. So as I said, that we have a wonderful and diverse group of panelists with us. So I would like to introduce them one by one. So we have with us Ms. Nida Rizwan Farid, who has already been a part of many of our public events. And she is an aerospace engineer by profession, and she is a renewable energy consultant as well. She has worked with some of the big brands like Airbus and Paul Scherrer Institute. She's the founder of Safe Jules, which is an enterprise. And then she's also currently working as a chief engineer at NRF Engineering Limited. She has her undergraduate studies done at MIT and a postgraduate degree from ETH Zurich. With her, we have Dr. Ramla Qureshi. Dr. Ramla is a PhD in engineering from the State University of New York at Buffalo, where she focused on structural resilience against extreme hazards. Dr. Ramla's initiative, which we specifically are very interested and motivated, once my students found out about it online, is the Women Engineers Pakistan. It's such an initiative which has connected 7,000 women in the STEM field. And their outreach of this program is to the 4,100 schools in Pakistan, Nepal, and US. Besides, they are training some STEM-focused universities. There are almost 15 or plus in numbers in Pakistan. So it's such an impactful initiative, and we are curious to know this journey and somehow learn from her that what it would take to motivate future engineers. We are also having with us Ms. Sana Rizwan. So Ms. Sana started her journey in 2010 as an energy auditor. And then she became a part of Rion company, which is, and there she had this whole elevation, a journey of different roles. So she started as assistant manager, then became team lead, project manager, then heads of project, and now she's the head of transformation, which is definitely a leadership role. So she's a role model for many of the future engineers, and besides a recruiter as well. So we learn her perspective. So she has a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and a master's in engineering management from NED University. And she happens to be the first female who has 9 years of experience in the renewable energy sector of Pakistan. So definitely from some sense, she's a pioneer also. And we want to learn definitely her journey and complement her experience as a part of this panel discussion. Besides, we have 2 of our faculty members also joining this panel. So one of them is Dr. Mohammad Moini Faizabadi. Dr. Moini has a PhD in economics, which he earned from University of Massachusetts Amherst. His research interests include political economy of innovation, technological change, macroeconomic impact on income distribution. Besides, he has taught in 5 different universities at US, which includes some public universities like Massachusetts, Amherst, Central Connecticut State University, and some liberal arts universities like Bennington College, Bard College, and Skidmore College. So welcome, Dr. Moini, on board. And last but not the least, we have Dr. Basit Memon. So he leads our ECE program. He's a program director. He has 5 years and more experience of developing an engineering curriculum for a liberal arts model. So he will probably be able to share with us that what is meant by this liberal arts model, what are its benefits, can be a source of some solution to some of the problems which were struck with the engineering sector. Besides, this exercise of curriculum review and curriculum development has been in consultation with our partner institutes like Olin College of Engineering and Harvey Mudd College of Engineering, from where we get to have some faculty to faculty contact on these important issues. He has a PhD in electrical engineering from Georgia Institute of Technology, US, and his doctoral thesis was among the 5 nominated for a PhD award named as Sigma Xi, and that's held in Georgia Tech. So that's all about our esteemed panelists. Now, before we commence our discussion, I would like to hand it over to 2 of our brilliant students from the class of 2022, Ms. Neha Faisal and Mr. Syed Hamad Mukhtar. They have worked quite hard gathering some information, which would serve as a prelude for this discussion, which will continue following their presentation. So over to you both, Hamad and Neha. Okay, so Hamad, have you unmuted your mic?
I have now. Can you see the screen?
Yeah, I can see the screen.
Oh, great.
I think others can also see properly. Okay. If you may start. Yeah, you can, please.
All right, great. So, budding onto the panel discussion that is going to follow up with this presentation, we'll start off with a certain evolution that we've observed in the engineering sector and concluding it with what is exactly beyond the local point. The content that we'll be covering would be consisting of an overview of the nationalization period, restarting the industrial sector, the 2000s era, in contrast with our neighbor, every graduate stream, engineering, is it really a lost charm? Light beyond the local void, and finally, the motivation. Starting off with the overview. So for anything to start, we must go to its premise, which is the partition in our case. So when India and Pakistan parted off in 1947, Pakistan received only 24 industries out of 981, which led to Pakistan making such decisions where it had to ensure that industries are in flux within the country frame, which is why industrial conferences resulted in the formation of the Pakistan Industrial Development Corporation, PIDC, in 1952. Follow-up was the first 5-year plan of 1955, where 185.11 crore were allocated for industrial growth. Production capacity was increasing, industries were emerging, export bonus scheme allowed more export by lowering tariffs. Industrial sector GDP boomed from 9 to 11.9% in 5 years. Everything was going great for Pakistan. PIDC had established 59 industrial units by 1971, and the National Engineering Services Pakistan, NESPA, was established in 1973 by the government, which to create a pool of talented engineers, attain self-reliance in engineering consultancy, and replace foreign consultants. So the industrial and the engineering sector in Pakistan was set to take flight in the coming years. But then there comes the nationalization period, where the government took over 31 industrial units and placed them under one regulatory body known as the Board of Industrial Management. Now, PIDC, which was working at a capacity of 54 industries, was now down to 12. The BIM units, the Board of Industrial Management units, employed 40,817 people. But the number went up by 58% unnaturally. because we see a pattern of overemployment that was seen in this period, and production was not quite increasing correspondingly, with labor productivity also declining in majority of the units. That is according to the government statistics. So 15 out of 54 units were able to maintain profitability in 1972 to 77, which is why when you see, so when we analyze the fact that the units that are profiting are 15 out of 54, naturally it was expected that the unemployment rate is going to rise, and it was at a 2.42%. And in the 1970s, all educational institutions were also nationalized, and then again we found the industrial sector and the engineering sector in sort of a curtailed boundary, where everything was being curtailed and constructed by the government. But then again, there was no potential innovative growth. And as you can see on the graph on the right hand side, the GDP growth rate from the period of 1974 to 1977, after the nationalization, it went down from 3.88% to 2.84%, which you may use to analyze the fact how unemployment and the industrial sector and the economical sector of Pakistan was on a declining rate. Over to you, Nia.
All right, so after a rough decade for the industrial and engineering sector, Pakistan found the means to restart its industrial sector. Starting off with the first power policy, which came in 1994 and brought about the advent of independent power producers. This policy resulted into an increase in the energy tariffs, but it also provided Pakistan to prevent load shedding for a decade at least. Following this, a private power and infrastructure board was set up also in 1994. This received about 116 applications for 26,000 megawatts of power generation. It can be seen here that the power sector is progressing in Pakistan. Then came about a big-scale privatization of PTCL and KESC, also known as KE nowadays. We also opened up the services sector, and a telecom liberalization policy came about in the same year. Another significant development in this era was the M2 Lahore-Islamabad motorway, which was South Asia's first ever motorway. Towards the end of this decade, in 1997, the Hub Power project was also completed. So we can see that this decade was very prosperous for the engineering sector, as the power sector and the telecommunication sector is expanding and new policies are being developed. Moving forward, I'll be talking about the academic progress during this era. We had Aga Khan University established in 1983 and LUMS was established in 1985, both leading institutes in their respective fields. Similarly, we can see on the table at the side, it shows a comparison of the number of people being enrolled in the institutes. And as we can see that the ratio is increasing down the table as more and more people are starting to go towards the academic field. Moving on, by 1977, there were about 10 private universities established in Pakistan. All right, so let's talk about the 2000s now. With the start of a new century came about vast developments. Operators like Jazz and Ufone entered the sector in 2000 and 2003/4 respectively. The Norwegian player Telenor took over the market in 2007, and UAE's Warid also came to Pakistan. However, during this era, economic growth came from the sectors which did not provide much employment to the lower income groups. Much of the increase in GDP came from the sectors which returned high rewards to the investors, but the share of wages was relatively low. Then came about the CPEC in 2013, which in a latter government has been prospected to provide more employment to the engineering sector in Pakistan. So as we can see that there were some problems faced during this era, but there were still many opportunities increasing in the telecommunications sector. Now I would like to hand it over to Hamad.
So I'll touch upon the 2000 educational plan. In 2001, 11 new private institutions were opened, and in 2002, a total of 29 private sector institutions sprung up. 2003 and 2004, Pakistan had a total of 53 private degree granting institutions. And as you can see with the table 2 below over here, which shows the number of student enrollment, as we see from the period of 2004 to 2015, as gradually more institutes were opened in the country, the enrollment of students, the number of student enrollment started to increase gradually. Now let's do a little contrast with our neighbor, how we see that Pakistan has been progressing over the period of 90s to the 2000s. But now let's talk about how in the two countries separated at the same time, how do we distinguish between the GDP growth of one country with the other? So you might see it written down that there was a luxurious lifestyle in Pakistan, but due to foreign investment. So what this exactly pertains to is the fact, as you can see from the graph on the right hand side of the GDP growth of India and Pakistan, from 1960 to 2019. In 1960, what we call as Pakistan's golden era, where there was a lot of industrial development, a lot of agricultural development. So Pakistan was set to take a flight in terms of its GDP growth, its industrial sector, and engineering sector. But at the same time, all of this was being complied via foreign investments in Pakistan. So while people in Pakistan were enjoying a luxurious lifestyle as compared to the people in India, India at the same time was focusing on made in India stuff for India until the 1990s. And as you can see, it is in the 1990 where you see a drastic change in the Indian GDP growth rate, where it starts to exponentially take off. The reason being, India initially had focused within itself, within its domain, on its own products and services, such as India streamlined Tata manufacturing services, and India streamlined all its industries so that India opens itself to the market in the 90s. And when India opened up itself to the market, the global market, it exponentially took a hike in its GDP growth rate, and it took away lead from Pakistan on almost every other economic front. So what exactly is the cause of all this? So one, I have mentioned earlier about the India focusing on India initially, but then also Pakistan has not been an important destination for investors as India has over the last decade. For example, let's say Unilever is India is one of the biggest markets for Unilever. So the reasons are summarized in a table of comparison here to sort of a slight understanding of it. You find a lot of political instability in Pakistan as compared to India. There's a legal system in India to protect the investors, and in Pakistan, on the other hand, there are high levels of illiteracy. Vocational training in Pakistan is quite missing as compared to in India. There's a highly trained workforce that's ready to get deployed in India, while in Pakistan, there's a lack of a highly trained workforce. And above all and everything, India is a large domestic market, while Pakistan is a more smaller domestic market too. Now, just to add into a little sort of a comparison over here, when I say that 1.3 million students sit in the IIT admissions test, that is just 1 lakh number less than 14 lakh students that appear collectively in all of Pakistan's engineering universities. So in an admission test for all the engineering universities in Pakistan, the total sum of students applying to it is 14 lakh, as we saw in the plus minus 550,000, as we saw in the table 2 earlier in the 2000 slide. But in India alone for the IIT, there's 1.3 million students that are appearing. So there's a swell in the engineering talent pool of India. And India has also seen a large uptake in venture capital driven largely by healthy returns in technology. And a lot of this venture capital and a lot of investment in the country and giving back to the community is inspired by Indian alumni working overseas as CEOs of Google, Microsoft, and Adobe, which you see quite missing out when you talk about Pakistani alumni working abroad. So let's talk a little bit about the unemployment. The unemployment percentage graph, which is present on the right, you might see that India is at 7.1% as of now in 2020, while Pakistan's unemployment percentage is at 4.65% as of now in terms of 2020. This is statistics are taken from World Bank. The reason you might wonder that why is India's unemployment rate so high as compared to Pakistan, despite India's progressing so much, where we're talking about how India's progress is so good in all the technical and economic fronts. Why is unemployment rate so high? Well, when you compare two countries, you must compare all aspects to it. So the percentage is the basic reason for the percentage being higher is the huge difference between the two neighbors, mainly because of the difference in their population sizes. India far outweighs Pakistan in terms of population. So, which is why you might wonder that why is it 7.1% as compared to a 4.65%, knowing that India is still progressing better on a lot of economic fronts. Now, let's talk about every graduate stream. What exactly does a graduate like me, Neha, and all those who are listening to us right now might dream of after graduating from our university? So, as you can see from the pictures on the right, you can see a Google head office, and you might know by this circular infrastructure that this is Silicon Valley. So why the Silicon Valley? Why is it a dream for us? Because it's a magnet for young and ambitious from all over the world. And why is that the case? Because this hub of innovation receives 37.8% of all USA venture funding. There's a cultural mindset that prioritizes platform development over product innovation. There's a 3-generation ecosystem of consultants, lawyers, engineers, and inventors. So it's not just a domain which is restricted to engineers or techies, but it's a domain which is open to every and any job discipline. And it's a holistic experience when you go to the Silicon Valley, in which everyone would dream of having. Just quoting Elizabeth Charnock of Bloomberg, I'll just say that she quoted, the Silicon Valley mantra is fail fast, and that of the rest of the world is don't fail. And every graduate's dream is that when they could exercise their ideas without the fear of failing or without the fear of any grades. So Silicon Valley is the right place to be, because you don't need to worry about failing. All you need to think about is innovating. So there are a great number of experienced, successful entrepreneurs and investors in the area who generously offer up their time to advise budding startups, which is also one of the great motivations for young graduates like us who wish to pursue a startup, and if they get to incubate it within the Silicon Valley, there's a great number of chance to get experienced and successful entrepreneurs to bud up their startups. So now coming to the question that engineering, is it a lost charm? So I'll start off with this understanding of my mind that I think that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. Now, to justify this statement, I'll move on to this slide. So when we talk about medieval institutions, I tend to find government to be one of the stakeholders that do not pay any attention to the problems of engineers. There are 100,000 plus engineers in Pakistan that are currently unemployed. The Pakistan Engineering Council has approved many engineering departments in universities, both public and private, without looking at the market's demand. And due to a weak economy, Pakistan could not manage to start new projects that could have accommodated engineers. And the existing industries and facilities are also suffering due to the economic crisis. So since there are new job opportunities for engineers, prospective students are focusing on going abroad rather than staying back because there's so much uncertainty. Here is what the element of the Paleolithic emotions fall in, where we engineers tend to get frustrated and worried about the current situation of the country, where there is just so much uncertainty, as it almost it's a Heisenberg uncertainty principle, where you know that you can either do a degree but you don't know about the job, or you know about the job or you don't know about the degree. So that's on a lighter note, that's the sort of the situation that engineers find themselves in. So to talk about godlike technology and what exactly is the prospects in the future beyond the local void, I'd request Neha to take over from this point. Neha, over to you.
All right, so talking about the light beyond the local void, I would first talk about the Engineering Development Board, which was established in 1995. It had a motto of strengthening the engineering sector and integrating it with the world to make it a driving force for economic growth. It was recently shut down in 2017 by the government, but it has been revived by the new government recently. As you can see, EDB has been a great factor affecting the automotive industry, especially in Pakistan. And we can see in the graph on the side that as EDB was shut down after 2017, the automotive industries went towards the sales went towards a negative scale. But as it has been revived, now the sales have been progressing again. Moving forward. Moreover, the IT sector has been at a boom and is still growing in Pakistan, as we can see in the graph, which also shows an almost linear increase in the sector's exports. And in the table, we can see that the exports are divided into numerous sectors of the field. Moving forward. All right. Similarly, the e-commerce industry. The e-commerce industry has been at a very huge boom, especially due to COVID-19, and companies like Foodpanda, Daraz, etc. have benefited and advanced a lot over the years. Pakistan has the 46th largest market of e-commerce with a revenue of about $4 billion in 2020. With an increase of 84%, the Pakistani e-commerce market has contributed to the worldwide growth rate of 26% in 2020. Revenues for e-commerce will continue to increase as new markets are emerging every day, and the existing markets have the potential to develop further as the competition grows. Its global growth has been prospective to continue growing over the next few years. Yeah, so I would now like to shed some light over the innovation-based industry growth, which has become increasingly popular in the last few decades worldwide. In Pakistan, it was started by Telenor, which was amongst the first company which entered the innovation ecosystem in 2016 through Velocity, which is an accelerator program and provides a sort of mini MBA to the participants. Similarly, Jaffer Business Systems has started investing in startups. It has recently invested in the Blue Tech Consulting and another green tech IoT company, ENA, they bought a significant stake for about 300 million rupees. Similarly, food chains like Dunkin' Donuts is investing in tech enterprises, and TPL Corporation has also been a major company which has invested in a few startups like the messaging platform TeloTalk. All right, Hamad.
Right, so continuing on what Neha has mentioned in context of light beyond the local void, the innovation-based industry growth. So we also observe that Fatma Groups as a fund along with the South Asian Gobi Venture Capital, combined the firm was the most active investor in Pakistan during the 2020. Elaction Groups was also a major corporate player and has participated in many S4 deals last year. Universities and government need to understand that these new tendencies and accordingly supply and regulate respectively the right-minded labor in the market. Like we mentioned earlier as well, what the gap, the standing gap that is missing between the government and the engineering market and the sector is that the understanding about the market demands, what exactly the market needs and what sort of an engineering sector does the market require. Therefore, the government and universities need to work together, collaborate on it to understand these new tendencies and accordingly supply and regulate these demands in education and industry. The engineering skills that students are learning are not irrelevant, rather they are the modus operandi of employment which has modified. So, as I mentioned, the final point, that is creating a startup could be thought more like an extended FIP, that is a final year project. Now, the purpose of the last 2 points, what exactly do we want to convey to them? The entire slide which talks about the light beyond the local void. So not everything is just doom and gloom. There's still hope. There's light at the end of the tunnel. There's a lot of progress going on. And what we are talking about is that engineering skills that we are learning at this crucial moment in time, they're not just useless skills or not just skills that you're going to use for qualifying an exam. Those are essential skills that you're going to require when you come into the industries, because the industries are now looking forward to individuals who possess a holistic approach to not just engineering problems, but also to the diverse economy and the people around them. So when we talk about the FIP, so as you see that companies are now investing in startups, the huge brands are investing in startups, and startups are more or less like an extended idea of an FIP. So what engineers can do is when they extend out, when they have innovative ideas, they can extend those ideas out as startups, which would lead inspire brands and huge companies to take their startups under their umbrella, and in turn, the engineers with their new startup can provide massive level employment to fellow graduate engineers. So what is the motivation behind all of this, behind looking forward to a new era of the growing industrial engineering sector? Well, where many search for what to take, a true engineer searches for what to get. And with that being said, as I mentioned earlier, when you create employment opportunities, when you create opportunities to give back to the community, as you see how India has progressed with its engineering sector, the industrial sector that went abroad has given back to the Indian community. Similarly, a true engineer in Pakistan too searches for what to get. That being said, we conclude our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamad and Neha. Now I would like to approach to our panelists. You can stop sharing screen. So I would like to start with Dr. Moini. And my first question is about so what we researched and what we found out is that perhaps there is some overwhelming role which a government can, always play. Sometimes it is a facilitator, but sometimes it can be beyond in creating opportunities, maintaining the stakes for the stakeholder. So how do you see the role of a government in this issue?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, you are loud and clear. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation, and I really enjoyed the data and the graphs, and everything was very up to date. Congratulations to our students, Ms. Niha and Mr. Hamad. I was thinking about the role of government when our speakers were talking about national plans. And it seems to me that there are 4 things that governments could do. The first thing is do nothing. And actually, that is a famous saying that when Great Depression happened in 1929, people went to the American president and asked him, what should we do? And he responded, just do nothing. Wait for the markets so that they adjust themselves. Of course, that is quite extreme. The second is do everything. Plan, take over industry, write and impose policies, and make everybody accountable. And of course, that hasn't resulted in really fruitful outcomes. We witnessed the collapse of Soviet Union, centrally planned economies, and even when you look at our countries, when governments have been too big, actually the outcome has not been quite satisfactory. The third is just plan, but that is it. So introduce 5-year or 7-year plans. And it seems to me that that has resulted in some outcomes, but for some reasons that I can explain in a bit, that time is over, that age is past. And the fourth seems to me is a little bit of planning and a little bit of participation. So provide some blueprint for the future of the economy, provide resources, participate in building infrastructure, which are so important, and also participate in investing and taking some risks. One of our speakers, I think it was Mr. Hamad, talked about the venture capitalism. It's quite well known that one reason that Silicon Valley is so dynamic, so robust, and so pioneer is because there are venture capitalists. Business, after all, is a risky activity because there is no blank check that one can write and give it to you and make a promise that you will be successful. So business has always been a risky enterprise. Actually, the concept of enterprise implies that economic activity is risky. And government can share the risk, can participate in taking the risk. And given that governments are so resourceful compared to individual persons and individual businesses, that can actually give some sense of security and some sense of hope to young investors and young entrepreneurs. What I'm talking about is actually a new concept, more or less new. I haven't coined it. I just borrowed it. It's called government as entrepreneur. And it's quite a new, one can say, paradigm. And there are historical examples. We are using the technology of internet, and we know that internet basically was funded by Pentagon, the US military. And of course, then private sector joined the enterprise and invested in various aspects of the internet and ICT technologies. The other topic that I wanted to talk about is when I was listening to our presenters, the first plan back in 60s or 50s, if I'm not wrong, went very well. But then we had periods of political instability and several coups and other issues. But why the first plan went well? One answer can be because economies back in 60s were less integrated into global economy. So when you are less integrated, you can more consciously and more effectively plan for the future of your economy. When you are integrated, as we all are to some degree, then planning becomes extremely difficult because now you are part of a global economy. And given that Pakistan economy is not a huge economy, globally speaking, it's a big economy in itself, but relatively speaking, it's not one of the biggest. I think it's 42 in terms of GDP and 22 in terms of GDP measured by PPP, purchasing power parity. So when you are part of the global economy, then the question of planning must be revised to what degree and how far we could plan for our future. Now, there are so many ties that connect us with other economies, other industries.
So I would like to then, Moinsa, extend with this to another panelist view and then get back to you. Maybe this sounds good to you. Okay.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah, sure. So I think there are quite much of elements which Dr. Moini pointed out. I would like to expand on this and have Nida to express her views about what kind of perks private sector would like to have, especially if government really looks up to them as being the job givers. So like Moini Saab mentioned that the participation of government can be modulated. But what is really the mindset of private sector, especially out of your experience in Pakistan?
So, Muiz, I would like to combine the answer of the question you just asked and also roll in a little bit of my answer for the previous question that you put to Dr. Moini.
Sure,
I think the two combined, you'll still get your answer out of it. So I personally think that a government's involvement should be much less in sort of accelerating the engineering sector in Pakistan. And when I look back at the presentation that the two students just shared with us right now, you see that there's so much emphasis on what the government did for the engineering sector, right? And we see overall so many government institutions we've talked about, and a lot of the engineering industry we talked about, it was the power sector, for instance, right? And it was about industries set up by government. But I honestly feel that the real bringers of change is the private sector, right? And the government's job should be to facilitate them rather than setting up industries themselves. I think Pakistan has a number of rich families and rich investors inside this country. And we've seen this again and again, that whenever a new government comes and whenever there's hope or promise of change, a lot of investors get really excited about now finally doing all the changes they wanted to do and doing, setting up all the factories that they wanted to set up. And then, the new government comes in and we still continue to have political instability, right? We still continue to have the government getting overly involved in bringing new policies in. And that scares the investors back down. And then ultimately that investment doesn't happen. So honestly, what I think the government should be doing is just facilitating. Okay. I think that the reason we have not seen so much growth over the last decade or decade and a half in Pakistan is less because the government wasn't involved. It's because the government has been over-involved, right? So what the government should be working at is removing the hurdles. And we have so many hurdles in setting up businesses here, right? So I run an engineering services consultancy, right? And I see this with other startups as well, and I see this with other factories and other initiatives as well. So for instance, if I take on a project, okay, after I'm done paying my contractors and my employees and everyone, I make less money for myself than I pay in taxes. Okay, so if I add in the sales tax that I pay the provinces and then the income tax that I pay the government as income tax withheld right at the start, I end up honestly paying 50 to 60% of my income as taxes to the government. So why would I be inspired to continue running this engineering services consultancy, right? And that's the case with many consultancies out there. There is no incentive to actually set up this. If I look back at 2012 or 2013, when I first returned to Pakistan, at that point in time, there was a 7% federal excise duty on services. Okay, and that was it. There was no provincial tax. There was no other income tax withholding. The 7% was the final tax. And what happens is that this is on revenues, right? So this is not on the profit you make, your actual income. This is on revenues that are coming in from which you're going to pay everyone else. So now that 7% has become about 25%, because there's provincial tax and then there's income tax withheld, etc. And this is all on revenues. So 25% of revenues gets taxed and taken away. And then I have 75% to pay the contractors and the employees and then get something out of it, right? So this is not facilitating starting engineering services in any way. This is not facilitating starting services for anyone. This is, decelerating growth in the country. Similarly, we see all the time with social media shut down, or YouTube gets banned in the middle, or stopping people from using VPNs, or stopping people, this desire of government now to control and government institutions to determine what industry does more and more. This is what is stifling growth in this country. So I would like government to actually take a step back, remove all these chokeholds they've put from all corners on industry, and then the growth will happen naturally, right? And similarly, if they provide political stability, right? If we actually have, a proper democratic transition every year where each successive government builds on the work of the previous government instead of trying to tear down the previous government's initiatives, right? If they just build on it and continue a stable transfer and stable transition every term, that would do a lot more for building investor confidence and driving growth through the private sector for the country.
Fair enough. Good to learn from your experience. In fact, that's quite enlightening. And at the same time, what I noticed is that you mentioned that within the last 7 years, that rise of taxes is from 7% to 25% is something really alarming. So what we normally look up to, private sector bringing jobs, is perhaps very much Pakistani thing to happen, because we believe that our government is always running short of the kind of, the available resources. So just from the, now shifting a bit of the perspective, I would like to ask from Sana a bit on, she has been in the engineering sector for the past 10 years, and she has been through this transformation. So what kind of, what has been your experience? How do you see it growing, and where do you see it's taking flight to in the future, the engineering sector, given the fact, the kind of problems we talked about at the macro level? But as a professional, how do you read the situation around you?
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. First of all, I would like to add what Nida has just said for the role of government. Okay, so I think that recently government has made a lot of changes in their tax reforms, and that has significantly impacted the engineering firms. There was a tax advantage that was given to all the engineering companies, the manufacturing companies, to hire engineers, and they were giving the tax benefit against it. But now it has been revoked. So this is something that should not be there. This is something that government seriously has to look into, so that people like Nida, that many entrepreneurs that I know, they are already working in the fields, they are doing good jobs, they are providing services to people like us who don't have time to do innovations and all the brain work, and mostly engage we are not engaging a lot of engineers. So these are the people who helps us a lot. And that's why this is my demand to the government to take this initiative back. This is not a good initiative for all the private firms. Because if a person is not saving money and doing a lot of effort for the country, and it's not providing any advantage to it, then definitely we are moving towards a downfall. There is nothing good in it. Now, as coming back to your question, in the transformation industry, I think what is really revolutionized is the digital industry. How are you actually like I make a lot of decisions when it comes to transformation. So yeah, and a lot of my decisions are basically data driven. So the digital platforms, the utilization of the digital platforms will be the new era for any industry. Like Telenor, I've worked with many multinationals like Telenor, Unilever, and what I've seen that what the good industries are doing, they're investing a lot of their money in digital platforms, in data-driven technologies, and they are creating good decisions so that they can thrive in the industry. So technology is one thing. Another thing is power. What I believe is power is the next big thing. Now is already like with the introduction of renewable energy. Now you see it's a thriving industry. A lot can be done in it, but unfortunately, and I can see from my experience, I don't find people in this industry. I don't, and since this is a new industry, it needs a lot of innovation. It has a lot of agility, and it requires a lot of energy. So what my request is to the students, to the academia, to the government, to invest more and more in these two domains, because these are the next two thriving things: artificial intelligence, data, digital platforms, digital transformations, and energy. For me, these are the three major areas that we should work on. Sorry if my internet is fine. It's a bit
yeah, you were quite clearly audible. I got your message. So that's good. Great to know from you. Maybe I would like to hear more about the kind of quality of graduates that you come across, because as you know that there is the trends towards engineering are kind of on their downside, primarily because it's kind of a lost charm for reasons. Maybe the kind of jobs offers they get are not competing well with other sectors. So what would be your take on that? How is it going to affect the motivation of the youngsters, those who would like to pursue engineering, but just they don't see enough remuneration attached to it? So how should they negotiate it first within themselves? Because giving in on a passion, I think, is something that should not happen to an individual. So any insight on that?
First of all, see, engineering is not a lost charm at all. Engineering has, there are a lot of opportunities. You really don't know the trouble we went through on daily basis, and we look for engineers to solve those problems. When last year I interviewed around, I think I conducted 600 interviews, 600, 700 interviews of the engineering graduates. Seriously, it was, laughingly called that, okay, Sana is born to conduct the interviews. But, what I found is that a lot of people who follow the regular stream, now I as an interviewer, I can tell you very clearly that if अगर आप उसी राह पे चल रहे हैं जो सबकी राह है, so then you are not, delivering value. I know that you are not the one who is going to deliver value, who is doing something new for me. And as an corporate person, I am going to invest in you in terms of your training, your salary, and everything. So I am looking for something new. I am looking for growth mindset. I am looking for problem solving skills. I am looking for the people who can convert the data into information so that I can take the right decision, right? And all of these things requires a lot of energy. do I have the energy? Do I have the time? No, you guys have the time. The new engineers, the new lot has the time. And what I want them is to invest in these three things. You know, invest in your problem solving skills. Invest in, maybe you should always have a growth mindset. You should always keep learning new things. You know what? An interesting thing that I can share with you that when I graduated, I didn't have a lot of skills, but there are a lot of skills that I have worked on with the help of these new digital platforms like, LinkedIn Learning. Every day when I use LinkedIn, I find a lot of courses, wo flash hote rehte hain, and in the side corner you can learn the good habits from three best practitioners, or you can how the people are working. So there are good articles available. So there's a lot of information available that you can utilize, and you can improve your skills that industry needs. Right? A lot of problems that I am facing as a corporate individual, बहुत सारे engineering के छोटे projects होते हैं. There are a lot of projects that we also think that, okay, we don't have the time and energy, so let's outsource these to the individuals who can really give them the right time. So engineering will never be a lost charm. There is always charm for you, but the quality of the application of your knowledge is very important. If you are just a degree holder, you are adding no value in it. So the skills are more important. The practical skills are more important.
It's very uplifting to hear this from you. And I would like to now engage with Dr. Ramla also, because she is really specifically working on this aspect. She has worked with the fresh graduates. And besides her cause of bringing more women in the STEM fields, I think that's something phenomenal. We want to hear about it. So because we have an example, so how can we definitely the quality is going to be a function of diversity. So if we don't really break that sample at that very initial phase, so it's definitely something that we don't want. So over to you, Dr. Ramla.
Thank you, Moiz, and that was a very valid point that you just said. Echoing on to what Sana was just saying, I would just like to quickly add here that to engineer, to automate is human. We've been engineering, we've been automating since when time began, basically. So engineering is never going to really lose its charm. What's actually losing charm is, our education is very, very stale. What we're teaching our engineering students does not really directly apply to industry, right? And that's why a lot of young folks lose heart. When you then introduce the concepts of gender, then a lot of motivation fizzles out immediately. So what we do through Women Engineers Pakistan is that we work with undergraduate women across the country. These are the girls who've already stepped foot in STEM fields, and they're really motivated, much like how I could feel how Neha was motivated when she was talking about the presentation that you guys made. So good job. But what happens is a lot of these young girls are, there's a confidence gap, which is a product of our culture. There is the gap where science is not a tangible concept. So Hamad, for example, sorry to put you on the spot here, Hamad, but Hamad has a higher probability of engaging with, fixing a laptop or fixing a car's engine than I have, right? So I only have bookish textbook awareness of what engineering is. Never in my life in Pakistan had I ever operated a heavy machine, right? Even in an engineering school, the lab assistant would say, "Baji, aap side pe ho jaye," right? So there's a lot of taboos when you introduce gender within the STEM fields. So what we see in Pakistan right now is that a lot of girls and boys, by the way, are shifting more towards the tech sector. And I saw that in the presentation when we were talking about Silicon Valley and the tech boom. And I always like to iterate this, that technology is a means to the end. It's not the end. right? So when Sana says that, okay, work on data science, but find out how to apply it to the energy sector, right? So the energy sector is what's important here. I, as a structural engineer or a resilience engineer, would tell you, okay, what about water resources, right? We saw that last year in Karachi. We saw massive flooding happening. What about where are the engineers for that, right? I am currently writing about how COVID was an architectural problem as well, right? We saw isolation, we saw working women suffering through it because of how when we are designing buildings, we don't incorporate these as a holistic thought process. So when I say that we don't have a worldview of engineering, that's because we've distilled information to just textbooks in our universities as well. And I myself am a product of that. So I had to go through a lot of unlearning to actually become an engineer. An engineer is somebody who engineers solutions, and that is the end goal, period, right? Now, we've talked about what happened previously in the history of Pakistan. None of it happened in a vacuum. There were so many different factors. What I want the current generation to think about is, okay, what happens next? In 2011, I believe there was a massive survey performed in India, and they found out that about 75 to 80% of engineering graduates in India were unemployable, right? And I used to think that if that's the case in India, where do we stand in Pakistan? The idea is to engineer everyday life, right? Not everything is solved by an app. So that mindset has to change. Moise, you asked me how we can bring more people, get more people excited about STEM. When I was growing up, PTV used to have these science quizzes and things like that. Where is science and pop culture in Pakistan right now? Why am I forced to always see a weeping woman in pop culture currently? That is my role model for my young generation right now, right? So where are all the leaders in pop culture? So that role models is very, very important, and we see that in every classroom that I've gone to for STEM outreach in Pakistan. I've seen girls get more motivated by my personal story than they have by, Marie Curie, for example. They couldn't care less who Marie Curie is, right? Because I am identifiable. I look like them. I talk like them. My father had problems with girls going to engineering schools, right? We had permission issues for internet as well, much like young girls in Pakistan right now do. So real life problems are very, very different than what we are taught. And that gap has to lessen for sure. For our youngsters, they need to know that, okay, real life problems are coming at you very, very fast. Pakistan is one of the top 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change, right? I don't see a single policy paper about that, right? Why aren't my engineers engaged in that, right? Why are we making cities in islands where we already know that the sea level is about to rise? So where is the thought process, and why aren't we speaking up? And basically talking about real life problems and actually engaging students. So I know that Hamad mentioned something about final year projects to be used as startups. Think of it as social enterprises. Think of it as how you can create value by solving problems so that you can earn money, which is the only way you will actually grow as well.
Yeah. So two very interesting takeaways from your answer, Ramla. One thing you mentioned about the holistic experience. So for that, I would like to engage with Dr. Basit, but before I go to that, I would like to mention that fortunately we have three very accomplished ladies on panel. You guys are the role model already. So I feel that kind of projection has to happen. And I hope we can get you on campus also. You can interact with our female engineering students specifically, because we have these societies where women in computing and engineering is something is the most. So even the patron in chief is our male faculty member because we don't have so many female faculty members in STEM. So we would like to have more engagement with you ladies were to accomplish. So Nida, would you like to just contribute something more on the quality of like the mindset of the young engineers? And perhaps then we can move to Dr. Basit about like what's the role of academia. One can expect.
So I'll echo quite a bit of what Ramla has said as well. I want to address 2 or 3 points. First of all, again, as Sana said, engineering hasn't lost its charm. I think we have to differentiate between the way the previous generations were brought up, the way, you know, the main education they had access to was engineering, medicine, commerce, and arts. Basically, you know, that those are the topics you would talk about, and your main jobs were banking, teaching, engineering. You know, so at that point in time, engineering wasn't a passion. Engineering was a job, more or less, right? So by our generation, that has started to change, where the diversity of professions and occupations you have access to has really increased. And I hear my aunts and uncles say the same thing when we try to describe the kind of work we're doing. Then they say, oh, you guys have such a different life. You know, we just had 5 occupations growing up. So things have changed a lot. And I have sort of given talks on engineering a couple of times in high schools to try to motivate children to go into it. And one of the things I tell them is that engineering is a mindset, more or less, right? And it doesn't matter whatever kind of engineering you choose. And here I will differentiate software from everything else. You know, as a hardcore engineer, software for me is a very different field than engineering. For me, engineering has the foundation of structures and electronics and fluid dynamics and things like that, right? So that is hardcore engineering. So no matter what hardcore engineering you choose, whether it's electronics or it's structures, civil engineering, aerospace, mechanical, bio, you are still going to have this foundation. So what I tell them is that if I look back at my life, and I look back at the life of other of my friends and colleagues, we have changed our occupations over time. You know, I mean, I graduated as an aerospace engineer, but initially I worked in the renewable energy field. I worked in wind energy way back in 2004, because at that point in time, it was hard for a Pakistani aerospace engineer to get a job in the US, right? So I switched to wind energy at that point in time. And later on, I started working in aerospace when I was in Switzerland. But since then, my work has been sort of half in aerospace and half in renewables. And now I have my own consultancy where I work on industrialization projects, on helping people set up factories for new technologies, but I work on energy efficiency as well, and I work on aerospace as well. So the point is, I see this with a lot of people around me, that they start off doing something else, then they switch to something else, and then they switch to something else. So I have sort of, my mindset is now that I want to work in wherever I feel I will have the most impact. So my dream is no longer to just be a pilot or an aerospace engineer or to be an astronaut, whatever my dreams were growing up. My dreams are now to contribute where I will have the most impact. And as an engineer, I know that till I die, that will be the case. Today, I may be working on energy efficiency. 10 years later, I'll be working on a different problem. 10 years later, something else. But because I'm an engineer, I can move from one field to the next because my mindset is as such. So engineering is a mindset. If you do not find, opportunities for you immediately right now, do not be disheartened, because that mindset is going to stay with you for life. And one thing I will add on to Sana's thing, where she's talking about power sector and artificial intelligence and data sciences. The thing is, engineering is in everything you do. Engineering is developing products, it's developing solutions. That comes in anything. That's in the health sector, that is in construction, that is in water resources, that is in the appliances you make for your home, or that is in the factories you set up, or the cars you make, or engineering is in everything. So the market for engineering will always stay, because you will always be developing products and developing solutions to the needs that you say. So do not restrict your engineering degree to whatever you have studied. Engineering can be used in every job around the world, except a doctor. You can't be a doctor after being an engineer. But yeah.
Thank you very much for this wonderful summarizing you did. I would like to now extend in the same vein to Dr. Basit that perhaps this is something that we are not conventionally, if I take the kind of baggage of history of engineering pedagogy, I think there is something terribly wrong because we have this mindset of job market, right? Why we are supposed to be solution providers. So how Habib is doing on that, and how are we living up to the liberal arts model challenge in engineering? And maybe you can just add anything that you would like to. Over to you, Dr. Basit.
Thank you, Moez, and thank you to all the speakers. It has been a wonderful discussion. I'll pick up from what Nida was saying last, and because I think that's a brilliant message that engineering is a mindset, and I completely agree with that, that as engineers, our prime role, no matter what kind of engineer you are, is a solution provider, a problem solver. You are the maker, creator, tinkerer. So it's all of that, and you apply it everywhere. In fact, what Dr. Moini was talking about earlier about economies being isolated earlier, and these days you have connected economies. I was again thinking about engineering principles that as a model, if you have connected economies and you're approximating it by a simpler model, the plan can only last so long. So the engineering principles that we learn, that we think of, you can apply it, and they are being applied everywhere. Beyond engineering, beyond traditionally engineering domain, economics, finance, biology, so they are being applied everywhere. In terms of the education or engineering education, I would say that what Sana was mentioning earlier, that our focus should be on the core properties or attributes that are needed to become a good problem solver or a good maker or a good creator. And that includes problem solving skills and problem solving skills in the context of complex problems. The problems that we face today are going to be interconnected. They are going to be complex network problems. So how do you make sense of it? How do you phrase it or put it in a format where you can apply your engineering principles to it and come up with a good solution to these problems. The other point that I would want to mention over here is that, yes, the problems are complex, they are networked, and by this very virtue, they have also become very interdisciplinary. So applying the knowledge of one domain is seldom the case for present day problems. You do have to apply your ideas from multiple domains, and you do need to have that ability to connect ideas from multiple domains to come up with the best solution. I think one of the speakers, perhaps it was Ramla, I believe, who mentioned that we need to apply our engineering knowledge to problems in society and think of our jobs or think of our life when we do need money to live our lives, but we also are working on something that is adding to the community, adding to the place that we live in. And that's something that is also not just something that's a good thing to do or something that you put it in the nice things to do list. That's also the need of the day, because the problems that we are facing these days are all falling in those domains. So our bigger challenges of this time are solving the education problem, equitable education for everyone, solving the water problem, the poverty, alleviating poverty. So all of these problems the grand challenges that we need to solve as engineers, because that's what we do. We solve problems, we come up with solutions. We do need to, all of these problems are related to community. All of these problems are related to we as humans, what we do in our society. So our engineering solutions or engineering education also needs to incorporate that element, to put that, bring that in the classroom, bring the community, bring societal problems in the community, and try to address them as part of your curriculum. I believe one of the biggest challenge that we are facing with our engineering education, or for that matter, when we talk about the mindset, when we graduate and go into industry, is our ability to deal with uncertainty. And so in our curriculum, we like nice problems where we can come up with definite solutions. And the problems that we have in our society, they're not nice problems. They're not the solution that we would come up with, or when we're solving those problems, we won't get that comfort. We would always be doubtful of whether we have come up with a good solution or not. But that's how real life problems are. And that's the same kind of problem that I would say we have with the mindset when we graduate and enter society as well, because we no longer have those linear tracks, as Nida was talking about her career pivots earlier, that you would go into an undergraduate institution. After that, you would have a linear trajectory into some industry. You would work at that industry for 20 years and then graduate from that industry and live a retired life. That's no longer the case these days. Again, we face that uncertainty, and we need to have that attribute of being comfortable with uncertainty in our curriculum, with the problems that we deal with our lives, the way we live our lives as well. And that's, I believe that I don't have an answer to this question, and that's an open question from my side to the panel as well, that how do we make our younger generation comfortable with that uncertainty in all facets of their life, whether that's the engineering education or what they would be doing in their future careers as well. And that's something that I would say that Moises' question was about Habib's engineering education model. We are trying to bring these elements in our curriculum, in our educational experience. I'm not going to say that we have the answer right now. We are still struggling. We are trying to change things. For instance, we have at least one course in our curriculum that tries to bring community problems from our society into the class, and students are required to solve problems in our society. We try to bring that element of uncertainty in our curriculum, making students comfortable with uncertainty, making students comfortable with complex problems, giving them the ability to tackle complex problems. But we're not there. We're trying, we're improving, and we're not there. And I'll just stop here with my question that how do you make everyone uncomfortable? With that uncomfortable.
So we can float that question, but I think Sana wanted to add something to this question or the previous discussion, and then we will definitely float this question about uncertainty within our faculty within the panelists. So Sana, would you like to add something?
I would just like to add what Nida was saying initially, that engineering is type of mindset. So I would like to tell you something about me that people don't know often, that I started my career as a biomedical engineer. I completed my degree in biomedical sciences, and I was always questioned initially that, okay, you are a biomedical engineer, you're working in renewable energy industry. Of course, like Nida said, that she didn't have a lot of opportunities in aerospace, so that's why she has to move her career. Of course, biomedical engineering was never very prosperous in Pakistan, so yeah, I had to change my path, and I opted for renewable energy. And that the question I was always asked is, what are you doing in this industry? You don't belong here, So that kind of mindset. But I believe that you cannot put someone in the box that you are a biomedical engineer and throughout the life you cannot do anything else. Okay, so stop looking at any other problems that you have. You cannot solve it at all. That's not the mindset that will, make you prosperous. Look at me. I have been successful. People who were finger pointing at me at that time are no longer in this industry. They don't exist. And I thrived that career for almost now 11 years. So we like taglines. She's a biomedical engineer. This is a men's job and this is a woman's job. अब ये लड़के का काम है, ये लड़की का काम है. ऐसा नहीं है, ठीक है? If you find any problem, you have the curiosity, you have the courage to solve it there. Also, one other point that finding discomforts and finding comforts and discomfort. This is also very important. As female engineer, I would like to say that yes, there have been a lot of experiences in my life that as a female engineer, I had to work at sites, and there were a lot of problems that I faced that men and they were equal for males and females. So don't go to the site with a mindset that you will find everything very comfortable there. You have to change your mindset as well, that there will be discomforts there. There will be heat, there will be shortage of water, or there may be other circumstances that you have to deal with. But you should believe that you will deal with it and you will thrive and you will get through it. That's very important.
Thank you very much, Sana, for your insights, and it's definitely very useful. So now there is a question being posted online, and I think Bas's question about uncertainty is broad enough. So maybe our panelists would be able to join it up. So I would just ask Ahmad to please narrate the question, and then we can have the two questions being rolling together. So over to Ahmad for a while. Yes.
Okay, you guys hear me?
Yes, I can. Others can also probably.
Perfect. So basically this question is posted on the Facebook live stream by Abir, that he states that it is true that incorporating AI and data science among other tech related breakthroughs have to be applied to engineering. But he thinks that many engineers realize it's too late and they think in their undergrad that ये चीज़ तो CS वालों की चीज़ है, it's not relevant to electrical engineering, and it is overlooked and yet an important issue, which he buds up with a question that since Nida mentioned about the role of fluidity for an engineer in terms of job. So he asks that how possible has that been, how possible it can be further?
Okay, so I think it's a directed question. Maybe part of it is about Nida's experience, but I think, so we can start with having this response from Nida, who can couple it with the uncertainty and the fluidity, sort of the two schemes we talked about. So over to you.
Muiz, can you repeat the question? I wasn't able to hear it very clearly.
So the question is about like looking for some writer skills. For example, some of the skills are meant to be known by computer scientists, but somehow engineering students realizing it quite late. That's how he started. And then the second part of the question is about your specific experience, where you said that you were able to pick and choose the problems over the period of time. You even foresee that you will be able to make those shifts. So is it really a choice of an individual, or like how is this going to happen? How he should plan in his own?
Actually, I would restate what Sana had said initially, that I wasn't able to find opportunities, so I shifted to renewables. Even at that point in time, that was a choice for me. So I took it as, okay, at this moment, I cannot work in aerospace because I'm in the US and I'm Pakistani, and September 11th has just happened. Yeah. But I know that this wind energy will be something that will be useful in Pakistan because we constantly have an energy crisis going on. So I would like to take the next 2-3 years exploring this, and later on I will come back to aerospace. But I'm not going to waste my next 2-3 years. I'm going to still focus on what I find will be useful. So I think engineers are able to make that choice constantly. And I do believe that I think it's important to say this to the youngsters who are graduating right now. And this, I think, goes directly with what Basit has tried to say too, about being comfortable with uncertainty.
Okay.
I think as a society, maybe this is there all over the world, but I think this is definitely here more in Pakistan. We are sort of made to think that there is a certain life path we should be following, a certain timeline we should be following. Finish your university degree in 4 years, either go for your master's directly or you work for 2 years and then you go for your master's, and then you get into a job, and then you're going to stay in that job for the next 20 years. 2 years after you start your job, you should get married. 2 years later, you should have your first kid, and then 3 years after that, the second one. And so people think that there is a timeline they have to follow.
Yeah.
That is not the case. And I think it is very important for our youngsters and our elders now to start saying that to the youngsters, that there is no timeline. Things will happen in their own right time, especially as Muslims, honestly, we are brought up to consider Allah is the best of planners, right? So accept the uncertainty, accept the risk, accept the fact that you don't know. That is perfectly okay. Have a certain trust that life will turn out okay, that whatever is happening will turn out for the best, and take risks then, right? So if we, especially for women, but I mean, this is also the case for men, but especially for women in our society, we are not allowed to make mistakes. The terminology that is used for us is don't do this, otherwise this would happen to you, right? Don't go there. What if somebody tries to steal your car? Don't go there. What if a man tries to assault you? Don't do this because there are too many, there are not many women in this field. So we have been told that it is not okay to make mistakes, right? And that makes it harder for people to accept mistakes. But failure is part of life, and failure is very much part of science and research, honestly, right? Like when we do research, we have a hypothesis and we try to prove whether it is true or not. And often the fact that it is, when we find out that it is not true, is as good as important a learning than finding out that it was true. Right? So failure has to be part of life. We learn as much from the detours that life takes us on as we do from whatever plans that were actually successful. Right? So it is important that we as teachers and we as parents and we as the elders of this coming generation also tell them that failure is okay. Don't worry. If you make a mistake, it's not the end of your life. Things will still turn out okay. And with this mistake, you are also going to learn. So maybe, I don't know if that's answered the question or not.
Yeah, it's pretty much answers. So, but I would like to now request Dr. Ramla also, because she has been working on the skills of the young graduates, when to adopt which right skills. So maybe she can answer, and then I'll move to Dr. Mohini also for his input. So first, Dr. Ramla.
Thanks, Moise. As for the question, so let me start by saying you are never too late to learn a new skill, right? When the pandemic hit here in the USA, they were looking for engineers who could decode machines that were coded back in the 60s. So those skills didn't even exist. So engineers had to, relearn things from scratch. So there's never, it's never too late to learn a new skill. Period. So if you are, let's say, a civil engineer and somebody said, oh, ye to CS walon ka kaam hai, koi baat nahi, ab aapko pata chal gaya, ab kar lijiye, right? There's always a time to start. Having said that, I think a lot of people here touched on this exact same point. So I'd like to reiterate a little bit here. Right now, engineering is multifaceted, multidisciplinary. There's no such thing as a single path of engineering. So rather than being the try to ask questions, try to do final year projects with somebody from, I don't know, mechanical engineering, somebody from CS, somebody from electrical engineering, somebody from humanities, somebody from history, right? Bring in these diverse viewpoints so that you understand why your engineering is important. About the question of getting people to be comfortable with uncertainty, I beg to digress a little bit here. I think Pakistanis are already very familiar with being comfortable with uncertainties. The only thing here is that we need to teach our students, bhai, light jati hai, kabhi load shedding hoti hai, we don't know. Kabhi bhi dil chahta hai, light chali jati hai. But we have trained ourselves कि अच्छा कल के कपड़े रात को इस्त्री कर लो जब बिजली है, right? So that's one very plain, very crude example I give of resilience. Redundancy is resilience, right? Preparation is resilience. Communication is resilience. Networks is resilience. So do that, right? You are already by nature, Pakistan in its situation, by virtue of being Pakistanis, we are already very comfortable in the midst of crisis. Use that, I would say, pivot to a positive aspect of it. Life is not going the path you thought it would be. Well, welcome to the world. Nobody's life actually went that way that they wanted. So I believe what helps prepare youngsters is maybe shadow internships, maybe bringing people like us, having these sort of conversations where the audience is a student body. Maybe what helps is real life examples, like of people like Sana, of people like Nida, right? And I think to say that we're not comfortable with discomfort I wouldn't agree with that. I think we're very much comfortable with uncertainty. We just need to have our sights set to a proper goal.
So I would like to then maybe the last question to Dr. Moini, because our time is already over, but I would like to hear from him also. What is his conception about uncertainty, and is it really something, a kind of mindset that we are investing in something, so we are always looking for a return of investment? Because that mentality really hurts the education process. If a student is investing some money or some merit in winning a scholarship, then the person is looking for some remuneration. So that mindset, which is somehow that instant gratification thing, is it something what we have in other developing countries, or like, what is your thesis about it? And maybe that would be the last thing we talk about.
Well, uncertainty is an inevitable aspect of life. And it's there because future hasn't arrived yet, and until future arrives, we don't know how it's going to look like. So we have to make a decision now and wait for future to arrive and then see what will happen. And there are certain, of course, solutions. It was mentioned that part of the solution is a cultural solution. When you live in an uncertain society, you learn how to manage it. And I think that's a very, very valid answer. The other solution is actually making institutions. When you buy a car, you might have an accident, and the institutional solution is to buy insurance. So insurance is basically an institutional solution to the uncertain driving and having, God forbid, an accident, which can be fatal, or at least it can cause huge financial damage. And again, that is why I think it's almost as a political issue as it's a technical issue, because then you need to negotiate with government. We are going to invest in this area or that area. What are the securities you can offer? What are the insurances you can offer? What type of participation you can offer to us? So I don't think we can leave government out of the picture, because even if we come to the conclusion that we don't need government, it doesn't mean that government will automatically reach the conclusion that it's not needed anymore. Yeah. So it's a huge institution, it's a huge body, it's a very powerful body, and it must be negotiated with and must be taken into the picture. There was one more point that I wanted to highlight, if I may, and that is the role of professional associations. Yes. Eventually, if there is oversupply of labor, it's a matter of supply and demand. But supply of demand must be managed, must be created. And professional associations, including engineering associations of all sorts, which are part of the civil society, can actually do that, can help basically fine-tune the supply and demand by negotiating with all sorts of stakeholders. And again, it's a political issue. And of course, it's very directly related to the question of democracy and civil society. So that was my thoughts. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope that we could continue this conversation, but we have some, not only just the limitation of time, but limitation of our speech as well, because it's the Ramzan timing, and you know that many of us are fasting also. So still, I think it was a wonderful conversation to hear from every one of you. You all really added a lot of value to this very prickly issue, which I would pronounce it as. However, this cannot be just one conversation. This requires a chain of conversations. And I'm very glad that some of our panelists even suggested more speakers who could, share some more insight. So we are all welcome. Habib is all about discourse on these issues which society is struck with, and engineering community is something very dear to us because we belong to this community. So we know that engineering is definitely not a lost charm. It's just that you have to rethink, because there's this wonderful ability of learning, but then unlearn and relearn things to suit better, because we are supposed to be adaptable. We can never be 100% sure that if you are enrolling in 1 degree program, by the end of your graduation, you will have the same amount of jobs available in the market. Like, see what happened to those who started a telecommunication engineering degree in 2003. Then by the time they graduated, all those jobs were being taken by electrical engineers. So things are really fluid. And it's like it's a part of the game. It's a bigger game. It's not just engineering to be blamed. So with that notion, I would like to say thanks to all the wonderful panelists I had today. Thanks for your time and for a wonderful discussion, everyone. And I would like to invite Dr. Waqar to also express some closing remarks. And then with that, we would like to call it a day here. So over to you, Dr. Waqar.
Thank you, Moiz. That was a very stimulating discussion. I think a lot of good ideas were proposed and discussed. I am, of course, thankful to our panelists, Sana Rizwan Khan, Dr. Ramla Qureshi, Nida Farid, who is very generous with her time and has participated multiple times in our events. Thank you, everyone. Of course, our faculty, Dr. Mohammad Moini Faizabadi, Dr. Basit Mehman, our students, Syed Hamad Mukhtar, Neha Faisal. I'm sure it took a lot of time to put together all that presentation, the research that you did. That was really informative. I think that set a good context to this discussion. And I think so, just as Moiz said, this is not something that we'll solve in one sitting. I think the key takeaway for me was the attitude to cultivate risk-taking in many different aspects. So governments need to step back and let engineers do their thing. Women need to, unfortunately, because of the current trends, I think undue pressure falls on current women to do things, to serve as role models, to walk the less trodden path, a pressure, for example, that does not exist on men. So, but hopefully, once more women do that, then future generations will not have to face that additional pressure that currently they have to face. Engineers also, in general, have to cultivate this attitude of risk-taking, what they already do. Nida, I think, put that very well, to persist and to adapt to new situations, which I think already is part of the engineering mindset. So these are all very, very interesting, very wonderful ideas. I especially liked Ramla's point about how a lot of work, a lot of role models are projected, but these are mostly coming from Western studies, Western efforts, Western role models, and they fail to strike a chord with our population, with our students. I mean, we not to diminish the achievements of Marie Curie or Grace Hopper or anyone else, but they lived in different realities, different contexts, different societies. The demands on them, the expectations on them were different. Their surroundings are different, and I think we will. And I'm very thankful to Moin. I'm confusing. I think I should also take care of my fast. So I'll not talk much more. I'm very thankful to Moiz. I remember when Moiz was putting together this panel, I asked Moiz to take care that it does not become a manel. And I think Moise took that to heart, and he made sure that all our external panel members are women. So thank you, Moise, for that. I think we need to continue in this direction and then highlight more women, so that our students like Neha and others who are watching, they gain encouragement, and they see that if Ramla can do it, if Nida can do it, if Sana can do it, then tomorrow they can do it too. I mean, there's nothing holding them back. And I think with that message, I'd like to close this talk. Thank you once again. And of course, I should also thank our invisible member who's made all this possible, Ala. I'm sure none of us have seen her because she is working behind the scenes. So thank you, Ala, also for putting all this together, making this happen. So thank you, everyone. And please stay tuned to our Facebook page, where we keep announcing other talks like this. There are more coming over the year. This was the first one this year, and we'll hopefully have more over the year. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye. Khuda Hafiz.